NanoHub U, online instruction.
Hey everyone, welcome to lecture 417. So today we're going to talk about the evaluation of the accuracy of the finite element model that we just developed in the last few lectures. And so this is actually just a solution of a steady state gradient between two walls, right? So of course this is a relatively simple example, simpler than some of the other ones that you looked at earlier, in fact, but just depicted slightly differently. So you can see, of course, you have high temperature over here, low temperature over here, and then this gradient is happening like this. So you have that gradient in general between two different temperatures. And now we're going to actually look at what would happen if you had a more complex geometry. And so we have two different meshes here. Okay, so one mesh is a relatively coarse mesh with very wide spacing, and that's depicted by these triangles, like both on the bottom. So this is a projection of those triangles into a 2D area. And then this is essentially the 3D mapping of these temperatures with a third axis of temperature on the Y or Z axis, sorry. And then in the second case over here, you can see it's a much, much finer mesh compared to the previous case where you have like a very, very tight spacing between adjacent matrix elements. And you can also see that shows up as basically a much, much smaller height of each of the individual elements in the 3D mapping of that structure, which is actually probably going to give us some more precise results we would expect. And so then if you actually just directly visually compare the two solutions, you can see, of course, that the solutions are fundamentally very similar in terms of the color regions and gradient and so on. Of course, the outer areas are exactly the same, right? Because the boundary conditions are the same and so on. But you can see internally, actually, there is a slight difference in terms of which regions are yellow and which are blue, light blue, and so on. So you can actually see that showing up here, that this has a slightly different value and so on. And so now we're actually going to look at a comparison of these kind of coarse and fine meshes. Okay. And so actually there are two cases that we would look at, like one in which you would actually have a low temperature region. Okay. So that's like on the bottom here. And you'd have an adaptive mesh, which is relatively fine mesh. And you can see that actually what's interesting is the coarse model has like a initial deviation from the correct answer at the beginning, but then there's also a small deviation at the end. But that big deviation at the beginning is very unphysical. And so you actually know for a fact that that's wrong just from conservation of energy. So it's a huge problem, actually. Now, if you look at the coarse model on the high temperature region at the top here, then you can actually see that it's actually very accurate at the beginning because the boundary conditions are set correctly. But then you do start to see a small deviation from the adaptive mesh at long times as it cools off a bit. But since the cool off is more gradual, then the coarse model doesn't perform as badly. So what it actually tells you is that if you're doing a transient cooling simulation, then the accuracy of the mesh or the fineness of the mesh is not necessarily like just a single value. It's really situation dependent. And so generally the recommendation in these kind of situations is that instead of just picking one type of gridding approach or resolution and then sticking with it no matter what, instead what we're going to do is call it a grid independent study. And in the grid independent study, what it means in practice is that we're going to take our initial coarse model and then look at what happens over time for the variables that we're interested in. And then we're going to refine the mesh, try it again. And then we're going to keep refining that until we feel confident that we've actually reached a converged result, which means there's no additional change that's of significance to our problem. Or in other words, the change in the problem with increased resolution is much less than the uncertainty of our inputs, for example, the heat conduction or the thermal boundary conditions and so on. So that basically is a way for us to reliably get reasonable results that would correspond to experiment in general. And just to kind of quantify this in more detail, what's happening. So we see that if we plot the log of the mesh size on this x-axis, then of course going to the left-hand side in the way that this is plotted means you have a finer mesh. And then we plot on the y-axis the log of the error. So this is actually a log-log plot here. So we have two types of elements that are in this system. And the first one is called T6 in blue. And so that's a type of element that has all the quadratic components. And so you can see that's more accurate as a function of mesh size. However, there's also the T3 in red, which has just linear elements, and it is not as accurate as a function of mesh size. And it converges a little more slowly. On the other hand, T3 is faster to evaluate. And so that's actually a key trade-off. So for a given problem, you may actually prefer one or the other, but there's not necessarily a clear solution, because as you can see, the accuracy of T3 is not that bad at this particular mesh size. And it's a little higher, of course, than blue. But if this error tolerance was on the order of 10 to the minus 4, then you'd be below that here, and you'd be able to calculate it probably faster than certainly this, and maybe even faster than this gridding. So there's not necessarily a clear-cut answer in these problems, but that's why grid independence is such an important study to perform every time you do this. In the next lecture, we'll talk about additional thermal modeling.